I'm Nima Rajan. Erin O'Toole will lay out a mission statement for the Conservative Party today at his first official caucus meeting since he won the leadership race last month. Hints of the tone and scope of his address to MPs, who will gather largely in person in Ottawa, were laid out in a Labor Day message posted to social media on Monday. In it, Mr. O'Toole promises a Canada-first economic strategy which puts the wellness of families and higher wages rather than GDP growth at its core. But today's speech may also hold clues as to how his party will handle the potential showdown in Parliament after the minority Liberals present a throne speech on September 23rd that will trigger a vote of confidence. A new survey suggests that while Canadians are divided over removing statues of politicians who harbored racist views or pushed racist policies, many oppose the spontaneous toppling of statues of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. Half of respondents said they oppose the idea of removing statues or monuments to politicians who espoused racist views or implemented racist policies, while 31% said they support such moves and 19% did not know. Leger Executive Vice President Christian Bork says the numbers suggest Canadians are more supportive of a deliberate process of dealing with such statues. Nearly 35,000 people are eligible to cast votes in next month's Green Party leadership race. Those numbers suggest that the party will smash the turnout in the last Green leadership race 14 years ago, when fewer than 3,300 people cast ballots in the contest that put Elizabeth May at the party's helm. The party says membership is up from 22,000 at the end of the 2019 federal election. The deadline to become a member in time to vote for the new leader was September 3rd. The premiers leading the two provinces hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic are set to hold a meeting just west of Toronto today. Ontario's Doug Ford and Quebec's François Legault have convened an inaugural summit to discuss what they see as crucial areas for cooperation, including economic recovery and health preparedness. They say the provinces plan to share lessons learned from the pandemic and work together to boost economic recovery and growth. New Brunswick's political party leaders are preparing today for the second set of televised election debates. Turnout for 2 days of advance polling that ended Tuesday was reported as high after Elections New Brunswick urged people to vote early in order to avoid long lineups on Election Day, September 14th. This is the first election in the country since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and masks and other precautions are being enforced at polling stations. Children across this country are experiencing an unprecedented return to school because of COVID-19. They are coping with a new safe normal everywhere, from the classroom to the playground. Yet several provinces are already reporting new COVID-19 cases linked to schools.
I would like to thank provincial authorities, local school boards and educators who have been working overtime to reconfigure schools in order to lower the risk of transmitting the virus in these settings. Although Canada is striving to maintain a slow burn, the average daily case counts has been increasing in recent days. This is concerning, and I want to underscore that when cases occur, including in schools, it is a reflection on what's happening in the community. So the key to keeping COVID-19 at a manageable level is for each and every one of us to keep up effective public health practices at home, at work, and in the public spaces we frequent.
Canada's Chief Public Health Officer also says it's difficult to recognize the virus in children, as they can display vague symptoms easily mistaken for other ailments. She highlighted the importance of everyone remaining vigilant in this fall season. Well, meanwhile, Alberta's Chief Medical Health Officer says 11 cases of COVID-19 have been tallied at 11 schools, but none of the infections were acquired at the schools. Dr. Dina Hinshaw says there may be reports of more school cases, but those people may not have been in school while infectious. One advocacy group has suggested that nearly 24 schools have had cases, including 8 in Calgary and 4 in Edmonton, based on recent letters and emails sent to parents. A group of Quebec parents has lost the first round of a legal fight for the province to provide an online learning option for families. Quebec Superior Court Justice Frederic Bachand refused the parents' request for a safeguard order that would have given parents immediate access to remote courses for their children. The parents are objecting to the province's back-to-school plan. It mandates that only children with serious medical conditions or who live with someone at risk of severe complications from COVID-19 can be exempted from physically attending classes. All right, well, after the break, our interactive segment, a deeper look into racism in Canadian policing and what needs to be done about the issue. I speak with a specialist from the Macdonald Laurier Institute coming up next, and more news from around the world. Stay tuned. The issue of systemic racism in policing has been highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, both in the United States and in Canada. However, we are yet to see real sustainable change in the system. Although Canadian policing differs from that of the U.S. in many ways, systemic racism in Canadian policing has been acknowledged by political leaders and the RCMP. That and the findings from the 2019 National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women and Girls, reports from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and the report into workplace harassment in the RCMP by the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission prove that systemic racism is undeniable in policing practices in our country. Well, joining me now is Dr. Christian Leuprecht, professor in leadership at the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College. Now, Mr. Leuprecht, you had written a commentary on this issue that was based on your written submission to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. And one of the things you mentioned in your commentary is that our political institutions, educational, health, and social systems are failing the minority populations in remote areas and and that the blame should not just fall on the RCMP in terms of systemic racism. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one reason why we set police up for failure is that we don't have sufficient coordination and funding for the services that can ultimately help keep people out of trouble, or to whom the police could hand off individuals who have challenges. So as a result, it turns out that people who are inebriated end up in custody for too long because there's nowhere to bring them. It means that women find themselves endangered and return to situations that they probably shouldn't find themselves in terms of hostile relationships. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we can do on the coordination side to set up these services better? In addition, if you look in particular at smaller rural indigenous communities, in urban centers, we tend to benefit from 24/7 services other than the police. But in many rural communities, the police is the only service that is available 24/7. And so it means when there's trouble, that's the people you call, and there's no one else to support them. So they're the people who also have to sort out situations that really are profoundly not law enforcement situations, but are probably best dealt with by other specialists. But it turns out that the sworn members are the only ones that are able to respond at that time.
And what are your thoughts on how the federal government is currently handling systemic racism in policing?
Well, you indicated that my testimony was before the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. That also included discussion of Bill C-3, which would have expanded accountability for the RCMP and also rolled CBSA into the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, so you effectively have independent civilian oversight of CBSA. It turns out that Bill C-3, as a result of prorogation of Parliament, has now died twice on the order paper of Parliament. Now, hopefully it will be reintroduced in a new Parliament, but it is a clear indication that neither at the federal level nor at provincial or municipal levels is there considerable political appetite for genuine discussions about reform or to engage in genuine police reform. Yet it is, of course, ultimately in a democracy, politicians that make the legal framework under which police operate, that ultimately set the framework conditions for cooperation with other agencies, for instance, privacy legislation, and that decide to fund organizations. And so ultimately, it is politicians that have to take responsibility instead of changing out police chiefs and hoping that they'll get a better result.
And in this commentary, you mentioned 3 key points, including transparency and professionalizing the police service. Would you be able to elaborate on these 3 points?
Yeah, so I think, look, this is an organization where you join at the bottom and you work your way up. Quite unlike most other organizations, large multi-$100 million organizations with several thousand employees today that would be led by professional managers, HR professionals, finance professionals. And so it turns out that at the senior levels, people lead and manage the way they themselves were led and managed, in part because the only experience they have is within their own particular police service. And so I think what it means, we need to think differently about the business of policing. That means police have to be more transparent in the way they do business. One of my concerns is that police are reforming the way they do business, but public expectations are evolving much faster than the way than police reform. And so as a result,
I apologize,
the gap
Mr.
between
Luprecht,
public
but we
expectations
are
and police
running out of
continues
time in this segment here, but we are going to have to get you back on the show because those are some great points, sir. So we'll get you back on the show, but thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
All right, don't go away. We'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned, everyone. Ontario's Health Minister Christine Elliott says the province is taking a 4-week pause before considering loosening any further COVID-19 restrictions. The move comes as the province reported 375 new cases over the past 2 days. Premier Doug Ford says his government is not yet at that point where it might consider reimposing tougher public health restrictions in some regions. Canadians' faith in doctors and scientists remains pretty solid nearly 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. A new survey conducted over the Labor Day weekend suggests that almost 8 in 10 Canadians still trust scientists, while a little more than that still trust doctors. The Proof Strategy survey shows little change from an earlier inquiry at the beginning of May and remains higher than the trust levels recorded in January. The federal government has announced what it says is a final 1-month extension of its commercial rent relief program for businesses hurt by the COVID-19 pandemic. The extension for this month comes 1 week after rent was due. That was expected to be, or what was expected to be, a $3 billion program has so far only provided $1.32 billion in aid. Critics have called for changes to the program, which requires landlords to apply for rent relief. A study shows fewer than 1% of Canadian blood donors in late spring tested positive for COVID-19 antibodies. Canadian Blood Services and Canada's COVID-19 Immunity Task Force released the findings of the study yesterday. It's based on more than 37,000 blood samples collected from blood donor centres across Canada, except Quebec and the Territories in May and June. The results suggest that by the end of May, as few as 0.7% of healthy Canadians had been exposed to the virus that causes COVID-19. An Indigenous artist from Manitoba is getting national and international recognition for her creative COVID-19 masks. Beadwork artist Cynthia Boham created 2 masks, one of which will be showcased at an exhibition in Banff. Her other mask, entitled Resilience, has been commissioned by the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre in Scotland. Mr. Boham says she decided to make the masks back in March to keep busy during the lockdown. A crops extension specialist with Saskatchewan's Ministry of Agriculture says frost that some areas of the province received overnight on Monday and early Tuesday had the potential to do damage. Shannon Friesen says some farmers may not even know what kind of damage there could be until their harvest is completed. Meteorologist Mike Russo says Saskatoon shattered a record that previously stood for over 100 years, getting down to minus 6.1 degrees early Tuesday. Labor negotiations between Ford and the union representing Canadian auto workers are set to begin today. Unifor says formal negotiations with Ford will set the pattern for talks with General Motors and Fiat Chrysler. President Jerry Diaz says Unifor is seeking product commitments, including electric vehicles at Ford's assembly plant in Oakville. Workers could strike if a deal isn't reached by September 21st. Toronto-based Porter Airlines has announced it is keeping its flights grounded for another 5 weeks due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Porter flights were first suspended on March 21st and will now not resume until at least November 21st. The airline has cited travel restrictions and plummeting demand for its decision to push back its relaunch date several times. CEO Michael DeLuce says all of Porter's markets are affected by travel restrictions on who can come to Canada. Lululemon Athletica beat expectations as second quarter profits slipped, despite a 2% increase in sales driven by a surge in online revenues. The Vancouver-based athletic retailer says it earned $86.8 million US, which is down from $125 million a year earlier. Revenues for the period ended August 2nd were $902.9 million US, which is up from $883.4 million in the prior year. A new Uber Green service is being launched in more than 30 cities in Canada this year, including Vancouver, Toronto, Waterloo, and Ottawa. Uber says the service offers rides in more environmentally friendly electric and hybrid vehicles as part of its efforts to become emissions-free globally by 2040. Riders will be charged an extra $1 per green trip, but will get 3 times the rewards points for every ride taken. Boeing has recorded its first orders of the year for the grounded 737 MAX passenger jet, but a new flaw has surfaced in another of its planes, compounding the company's struggle to recover during a pandemic that has undercut demand for new jetliners. On Tuesday, Boeing said it is inspecting part of the tail of the two-aisle 787 after finding that pieces were clamped together too tightly, which could lead to premature fatigue of a part called the horizontal stabilizer. An Oshawa, Ontario family killed in a shooting last week will be remembered tonight with an online prayer service. All right, we'll have more news from around the world coming up after the break. An update on the U.S. presidential election, and Afghanistan's vice president narrowly survives an attack. We'll be right back. Well, with Election Day just 8 weeks away, Joe Biden is maintaining the same comfortable lead in most national polls that he enjoyed through the summer. He also has an advantage in many of the battleground states that will decide the election. But President Trump remains in striking distance, counting on his most loyal supporters and the hope that disillusioned Republicans ultimately swing his way. Both parties are braced for the prospect of sudden changes ahead, particularly as President Trump makes an aggressive pitch to voters focused on safety and fear of violent unrest. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign says the U.S. president is considering spending as much as $100 million of his own fortune on his re-election effort.
But if we need it anymore, I'd put it up personally, like I did in the primaries last time. In the 2016 primaries, I put up a lot of money. If I have to, I'll do it here. But we don't have to, because we have double and maybe even triple what we had a number of years ago, 4 years ago.
Campaign officials are trying to buck up key supporters and donors in the face of recent polling numbers. President Trump says he's prepared to spend whatever it takes to win a second term in the White House. More than 300 civil society groups, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the International Service for Human Rights, are urging the United Nations to set up an international watchdog to address human rights violations by the Chinese government. The call adds to recent international pressure on Beijing over its handling of issues like protests in Hong Kong and detention centers, what the government calls vocational or training centers for Uyghur Muslims and others in the western Xinjiang region. Officials in Afghanistan say a bombing that targeted the convoy of the country's first vice president has killed 10 people and wounded more than a dozen others. First Vice President Amrullah Saleh suffered minor burns in the morning attack, while one of his bodyguards is among the dead. No group immediately claimed responsibility for the bombing, but the Taliban denied that they were involved. Britain's government is banning gatherings of more than 6 people to limit the spread of COVID-19. Party-going young adults who disregard physical distancing rules are being blamed for the spike in new cases. The new law applies to both indoors and outdoors, including private homes, restaurants, and parks. The UK is the European country with the worst death toll from COVID-19. Meanwhile, British Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the new limits on social gatherings in England to 6 people are set to stay in place for the foreseeable future, potentially until or even through Christmas. Mr. Hancock said Wednesday that the new limit, which will come into force and be enforceable by law from Monday, will provide more clarity to people and should help keep a lid on a recent sharp spike on new cases of coronavirus. While Indonesia has recorded more deaths from the coronavirus than any other Southeast Asian country, it also has seen the most fatalities among medical workers in the region. Experts say poor health protocols in hospitals, a lack of regular testing of healthcare workers, and delays in test results have contributed to the deaths. Indonesia also has one of the lowest numbers of doctors per capita in Southeast Asia, leading to concerns about the long-term impact of the coronavirus on the nation's healthcare system. Late-stage studies of AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine candidate are on temporary hold. The company is investigating whether a recipient's potentially unexplained illness is a side effect of the shot. Temporary halts in medical studies aren't uncommon. 2 other vaccines are in huge final-stage tests in the United States. One is made by Moderna and the other by Pfizer and Germany's BioNTech. A couple's plan to reveal their baby's gender went up not in blue or pink smoke, but in flames when their device that they used sparked a wildfire that burnt thousands of acres and forced people to flee from a city east of Los Angeles. The fire prompted evacuations in parts of Yucaipa, a city of 54,000, and the surrounding area. Water-dropping helicopters were brought in as the fire grew to 11.5 square miles, with more than 500 firefighters struggling to contain it. The couple that set the blaze could be charged for the cost of fighting the blaze, which could cause criminal charges. A lot of servers and bartenders have seen their income fall off because of the coronavirus pandemic. But in Anchorage, Alaska, a server got a big payday from something else that's contagious: kindness. Angelina Backus says a guy at a table with 3 other men asked to chat with her. When she did, the guy opened his wallet and peeled off 5 $100 bills. It was part of a social media trend called Venmo Challenge, when people use the online payment app to send money to a friend who uses the money to build up a bankroll for big tips. Once Miss Backus realized what was up, she said it was very special. And that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for news on demand, you could always log on to thenewsforum.ca and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. We'll see you next time.